Hi, everybody, and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Judah Grunstein, WPR's editor-in-chief, and I'm joined by WPR managing editor, Freddy Deknatel. Hi, Freddy.
Hey, Judah.
And WPR associate editor, Prachi Vidwans. Hi, Prachi.
Hi, Judah.
We'll be talking about some of the stories that caught our eye this week, but before we get started, just a quick reminder for everyone listening that the interview episode of the podcast went live Wednesday. Elliot had a fascinating discussion with David Carroll of the Carter Center about the work of independent election observers and why it's just gotten much more difficult. Prachi, getting to our weekly discussion, what story caught your eye this week and why?
This week, and I guess for the last 2 weeks, I've been following developments in Hong Kong. Last week on June 30th, the new national security law went into effect, which criminalizes secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign or external forces, and crimes for which you can now spend life in prison. And, many have said that this is basically the end of Hong Kong as we once knew it. And it's been a pretty dramatic shift. That day saw activists deleting Twitter accounts, a pro-democracy group Demosisto disbanded. Activists started talking about, needing to move abroad into exile, essentially, so that they wouldn't face some of these charges. And people abroad are discussing whether or not they'll be able to go back home. So it's been just a very dramatic shift. And yet, at the same time, some Hong Kongers are just responding with so much bravery in the face of all of this. We also saw a lot of images of protesters going out into the streets in droves the very next day, in spite of the danger of protesting under these circumstances, holding signs with nothing on them, just blank protest signs, because just to emphasize that under this law they don't even know what's illegal to say. And it's just been very inspiring to see the number of people that have continued to protest despite this, and also I'm just in awe of it. Even last year during the Hong Kong protests, activists were expressing the fact that, they weren't doing this out of hope necessarily. They didn't necessarily believe that Hong Kong would be completely free, completely democratic, and away from the rule of the Chinese Communist Party one day, but that it was a last stand. And to me, this national security law coming into effect seemed like, okay, well, that's the end, but clearly it hasn't been. And specifically that day, there was a Facebook post by this activist that I know, and he basically said, now we're joining the great number of people that live in authoritarian countries under very strict regimes who continue to agitate, continue to protest. And he wrote, "I don't believe that the roads I have traveled are in vain." So I just found all of this really moving. It's frightening, it's moving, it's a mix of things. So that's what I've been thinking about this week.
Freddie, we've seen it coming for a while, and yet now that it's happened, it seems to have happened very swiftly, both in Hong Kong, but also the reaction around the world to the Chinese government's quick moves there.
Yeah, we've seen a bunch of governments criticize Hong Kong, and there are potentially sanctions on the table, although in the U.S. it looks like not a huge amount will happen because Donald Trump probably doesn't want to anger China too much. The one thing I was just going to say, following on from Prachi, was that it also reminds me of the piece that she wrote last week, specifically about the Black Lives Matter protests going global, and whether this growing social justice and protest movement, which we've seen already, has sort of incorporated other ideas like debates over Israel and Palestine and Palestinian rights, whether it will also extend itself to Hong Kong and the pro-democracy movement there. I wouldn't be surprised if we see that. I think that was one of the great points that Prachi made in her piece last week, that we're seeing this growing movement that, even if it's focused on specific issues like Black Lives Matter, it's extending around the world in specific contexts, sort of adapting to different countries' circumstances. And we've seen for the last 2 years, since there have been steady protests in Hong Kong, how resourceful activists and demonstrators there have been. And I wouldn't be surprised if they tried to seize on, this sort of global groundswell.
I guess for me, what's most striking about Hong Kong is that usually when you see a country, especially more recently, I should say, because in the past it wasn't always historically the case, but more recently when you've seen countries move from relatively open or semi-democratic or democratic systems into authoritarian systems, it's been a much more gradual process. The new sort of democratic coup method of constitutional revisions and slow capture of state institutions and the judiciary being brought to heel and things like that, state institutions being co-opted and appropriated. And in this case, it's literally overnight. And so, as you mentioned, Prachi, this idea of speech becoming blank posters because they don't know exactly what actually is legal or illegal to say anymore because of how vaguely the law is defined. And then the next step from there is that even silence becomes suspect because if you're not vocally supporting the Communist Party, you're probably suspect just because of your silence. So I agree in terms of the admiration for people who, in spite of that, continue to come out into the streets. And I have to say that as a journalist, and all of us as journalists, I often think when reading or covering issues like this, of the luxury that we have to be critical and have criticize the government and governments. And I often wonder whether I would have that same courage, for instance, to go protest in the context that the Hong Kongers are protesting now, because it does take an enormous amount of courage to do so. And I guess that global solidarity, it helps, but also, as you mentioned, Prachi, it doesn't substitute for the kind of organization on the ground that achieves social change, and it can also sometimes come with backlashes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when movements try to coordinate from abroad, there can be serious repercussions for them. I mean, it's very common that activists living in exile will either need to be extremely vocal to the point where enacting retribution on their families, for example, would be bad PR for the government, or they need to remain quiet. There's very little middle ground for activists who are working from exile, unfortunately. And, even though they might not be detained and spend life in prison, they can face many other consequences for speech in that context. I think it's also interesting. Well, I've also been thinking about journalists as well because, as many have pointed out, this law has an extraterritorial application as well, where that can affect journalists, including foreign journalists working in Hong Kong, who could be subject to this law if they write something critical about Beijing. So I think as time goes forward, it's also going to be harder and harder to know what's really happening in Hong Kong and to get a sense of what forms dissent is taking there, in the way that it kind of is difficult to get a good sense of that in mainland China as well.
Freddy, Prachi mentioned this question of being so vocal that the public perception might constrain or deter the Chinese government from repression. I guess what's, I think, also most shocking or revealing in the way that a bucket of cold water can be revealing is the degree to which China really doesn't seem to care about public perception in terms of Hong Kong, in terms of even domestic critics. Ben on China Note wrote about Xu Zhangrun, a prominent legal scholar who was just arrested this week after having criticized Xi Jinping and the Communist Party over the past few years. So Hong Kong, this last sort of geographical area that was outside of the censorship and the repression is now closed off. Ben noted that academics in China had often kind of had a if not a get out of jail free card, at least some more tolerance by the state for criticism. That seems to be disappearing. We've seen governments, UK has offered passports to the Hong Kongers. Australia is doing the same, extending visas for Hong Kongers that are already there. And there seem to be some sanctions in the works. And none of that seems to be making any difference at all to China, and with regard to the situation in Xinjiang and the Uyghur Muslims that are being detained and in concentration camps. It really seems like there is no deterrence, and there is no sense of public perception that is deterring the Chinese government at this point.
No, it hasn't. I mean, I think that this is just a continuation of a trend that we've seen for a while now. And I think it's debatable how much of it is, just China's assertiveness on its own, how much of it is knowing that the U.S., among others, but really the U.S., won't push back as hard because of Donald Trump and his interests. But whether it's domestic issues or an issue in Hong Kong or issues farther in the region, in Taiwan or in the South China Sea. I mean, we've seen China basically acting like it can and should be able to do what it wants, at least in its neighborhood. And I think that there's certainly a view among, Chinese officials, but also, analysts in China who are close to the government or sort of have the government's ear that in their view, it's not, overly aggressive or assertive, that they're just trying to establish their primacy, at home essentially, and in the region, and pushing back, against what has obviously for decades been U.S. primacy in Asia. And I think that that's something that we've been talking about for a while, that we've seen developing more and more. And the question is, if the U.S. isn't going to push back on this, and Europe maybe might sanction China, but they obviously have a lot of trade and other economic interests in China, who is really going to push back?
I think the one thing that is surprising to me, I mean, it's true that the economics of the relationship with China make it a complicated calculus, both for the U.S. and for Europe especially. But I'm pretty struck by how quickly in Europe the consensus has shifted to closer to the American position and the American line, whether it's with Huawei and participation in 5G, or increasingly considering China as both a partner or a country with whom or with which Europe cooperates, but also the elements of strategic competition and rivalry and confrontation have been integrated into the appraisal. That's been a pretty quick shift, and the U.S. was sort of a precursor, and for a long time Europe and European countries were resisting that. And I think that that perception of China and of some of its recent moves has really sort of solidified the wariness that European countries have toward China now. And I think that that'll be something that'll be very difficult for China to reverse. And I think that over the course of time, it's going to develop into something that might look much more forceful than what we're seeing today. Obviously, time will tell. Prachi, any last thoughts before we move on to to what Freddy wanted to flag?
Yeah, I don't want to overstate this, but it has brought to mind a conversation I had even just a couple years ago with somebody who was saying, who's arguing basically like, yeah, there's, some dissidents are being silenced in China. I guess it's authoritarian, but really, it's not so bad, and it doesn't affect a lot of people, and most people are very happy. And, there's a great sense of community in China. And that was a surprising conversation, but also not really. I had heard that sentiment a number of times from people who were kind of surprised that, at the time that I would, be so hard on China for going after dissidents and silencing dissidents. And I think that in the last couple of years, even this year, it's kind of hard to deny now when you have both the example of what's been happening in Hong Kong and the example of silencing of critics in China during the outbreak of the coronavirus. The entire narrative has shifted to China equals authoritarian, and it's bad.
All right, Freddy, which story did you have on your mind this week?
Two articles, but the same really, by Peter Beinart, a longer essay in the journal Jewish Currents and a shorter op-ed tied to it that was published in the New York Times about basically the Jewish case for a one-state or binational solution in Israel and Palestine. Peter Beinart is, someone who's been arguing more toward this position for a while, and also given his background as, someone who supported the Iraq War and was, a great proponent of the two-state solution and the peace process, which is a large part of what the essay at least opens with. It's a very personal piece, but it's also very interesting because it just showed to me the way that the sort of boundaries of debate have expanded in the U.S. over Israel and Palestine. A lot of what Beinart writes about was written about in the past. Most of all, in 2003, Tony Judt, the late intellectual, essentially wrote a similar piece in the New York Review of Books, arguing for, the case for a binational state, that the Israel as a Jewish state could be a Jewish state still if it was binational rather than being, just the Israel that it is today. And I think that, and Tony Judt at the time was, widely criticized. It was cast as being anti-Semitic. It was cast as being anti-Israel. Peter Beinart's certainly getting some criticism for this now, but it's also treated much more as a not outside the bounds of debate. The New York Times, let alone, probably would not have published an op-ed like this, 10 or 15 years ago. And so I think it was just telling in and of itself, related to Israel-Palestine, but also about an encouraging sign that foreign policy debate in the U.S. is opening up in a way that it hadn't for a while.
I think for me, the point that he makes in the article that kind of jumped out at me was that over the past, I guess, as the two-state solution seems to be withering on the vine and dying a slow death, there's been this line of argument that the options are a two-state solution or apartheid, where Israel controls all of the territory, but the West Bank and Gaza are essentially under occupation and without citizen rights. And I guess Beinart adds a third option, which is really frightening, and he talks about basically one ethnically cleansed Jewish state, whereby Israel annexes the West Bank and forcibly removes the population there, or significantly reduces it. And whether or not it's realistic or possible, it makes it clear really that that things can. There's this idea that that there's this status quo in Israel and it's bad and it can't get worse. And the truth is that it really can get quite a bit worse. I guess most of the objections that are being raised to his piece are that basically this that it's far-fetched and utopian and unrealistic to expect the Israeli Jewish population and the Palestinian population to live peacefully in one state. Beinart points out that the Israeli Arab population already lives in Israel peacefully and really is engaged and increasingly engaged with the political landscape and the political arena. And his idea is that basically two things. One is that as people enjoy more political rights, they move away from extremism and violence. And I think the other one that's really, to me, most compelling and most convincing is that, as outlandish, and I put that in scare quotes, as his suggestion or his proposal is, what he says is that equality in a single state has a huge moral and ethical force as an argument, and that it's the kind of argument that can be very easily leveraged for a popular movement. And it's something that Dalia Hatuka mentioned in a recent in-depth article that we ran on Palestinian self-determination. But just that idea, what can actually form the power behind a social movement that can really be compelling and convincing to not just people in Israel and Palestine, but around the world. And I think he's right that a one-state solution based on equality has that.
Yeah, exactly. I think that these arguments are, the natural follow-up to what Dalia mentioned toward the end of that feature, which was, this desire and this call for sort of reimagining of what Israel could be, reimagining even what Zionism is and what Jewish nationalism means today or should mean, and also some of that draws on history and what did Jewish nationalism and early Zionism mean 100 years ago or more. And I think also the other compelling part to me that Beinart points out, and that others have before too, is that in addition to being a moral and ethical argument, if we look back in recent history and political science, we've seen examples, whether it's South Africa or Northern Ireland, where you had a state where there were two peoples essentially, but they were one population didn't have equal rights, and were treated massively unequally, and the idea that was sort of the status quo and it can never change. And I think Beinart makes the very compelling point that in both of those countries, you basically have a model for what he's arguing and what others have argued could happen in Israel-Palestine, not tomorrow and probably not even in a few years. It would be a much longer project than that. But there are other cases where, these totally segmented societies where power rested with one authority that effectively ruled over two sets of people, that there is a path forward there that can be really driven by equality most of all.
Yeah, mentioning Dalia's article as well, it struck me as quite interesting because in her piece, she seemed very, very skeptical that this vision she put forth of one equal state was even possible, or that it would have any kind of support among Israelis. So it was interesting to see a piece come out so soon after that expresses the same idea. And as you mentioned, it's not the first time, but this article mentioned that there seems to be some growing support for the idea of an equal state, and especially that there seems to be a generation gap. So it's interesting that that public opinion may be shifting toward this. I mean, very, very slowly, but that, this idea is not as controversial as it might once have been, and that, Dalia's piece, which was quite pessimistic, there might be more cause for optimism there.
I know from just my own personal discussions with a friend who's very active in terms of the movement for Palestinian rights, that for a number of years, I'd say at least 5, maybe 6, that this idea of one state for both peoples has been increasingly the focus of her activism and more people in the movement. So it's not necessarily a new idea on the Palestinian side. It's important also, I think, to note that Peter Beinart is speaking from the perspective of an American Jewish point of view. I don't know in terms of the polling. I suspect it's not a terribly popular opinion in Israel itself. But I guess an important caveat, Freddy, to the examples, the historical examples you mentioned, and that Peter Beinart mentions, post-apartheid South Africa and Northern Ireland after the Good Friday Agreement. There are examples in the Middle East, whether it's Lebanon, Iraq, Syria to an extent as well, of multicultural, multi-ethnic, and in some ways multinational states in the Middle East that have not been able to peacefully coexist, or very difficultly been able to. So I think all the usual caveats apply. There's one thing in terms of this question of the range of debate. And what is now, I guess, permissible or considered reasonable. I think the whole question of annexation has really widened the range of what's considered reasonable because of how unreasonable annexation is of the West Bank, and the way in which it was sort of this worst case scenario that's now been normalized, and not only normalized, but considered, and up until recently there was a plan and a schedule for it. That seems to have been put on the back burner. But you mentioned that it would have been hard to imagine a New York Times op-ed on this. I'm going to read you a quote from one. Here's the quote. If the present interdependence and the historical fact of Jewish-Palestinian coexistence guide their leaders, and if they can see beyond the horizon of the recent violence and thirst for revenge toward a long-term solution, then these two peoples will come to realize, I hope sooner rather than later, that living under one roof is the only option for a lasting peace. Any idea who wrote that?
I guess I want to say it's like probably, it wouldn't surprise me if it was written in the early 90s around Oslo.
It's actually from January 2009. It was a New York Times op-ed written by Muammar Gaddafi.
Wow.
It was right after Gaddafi came in from the cold, and he was proposing what he called Israel-Palestine, one state solution that he'd been speaking of at that point for, I think, about a decade. But just to point out as well, it was widely ridiculed at the time, just down to the name of Israel for the country, the fact that it was Gaddafi of all people who was talking about lasting peace, and the idea that it was a lasting solution. But again, I think it does sort of underscore the point. It was published in the New York Times probably for the publicity value of Gaddafi writing something like that, and not because it was considered reasonable, whereas Beinart's piece is published because, as utopian and as ambitious it might be perceived, it's still, I think, at this point considered much more reasonable as part of the debate. So it's more like the exception to what you said that proves the logic of what you said. I do think the debate has been expanded dramatically recently over the past 5 years, and then that's being accelerated, I think, with annexation.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a good point that what is driving this expanding debate is not just shifting views in the U.S., maybe, but events in Israel and Palestine. Criticisms of Israel's settlement expansion, for example, or even calling it an occupation. It wasn't uncommon in at least certain corners of American media to, that was branded as a pro-Palestinian view, even though it was just, observing events on the ground. And I think that given how much further to the right Israel has gone, to the point now of, the looking over the cliff of annexation, these things are not seen as pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli one way or another. It's just the reality on the ground.
It's important to point out, too, that annexation is the culmination of the last 3+ years of the Trump administration's one-sided approach and real almost pushing the Netanyahu government to more and more extreme positions, whether it's the recognition of the Golan Heights as Israeli territory, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, the U.S. embassy, and cutting off funding for the Palestinian Authority or for UN programs servicing Palestinian refugees. But Prachi, one thing that did come to my mind, and it kind of links the two topics we talked about, this idea of a social movement and a popular movement being the last great hope for Palestinian self-determination, and that raises the possibility of transnational support of the sort of global protest community and social movement community for the Palestinian movement, both within Palestine and Israel and around the world.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that. I think that in reporting for the piece that Freddy mentioned that I wrote last week, I came across the work of this sociologist, Jackie Smith, who discusses the way that transnational links and economic globalization as well have brought forth a different trend of human rights globalization. So basically, as it became easier and less expensive to travel, as people could more easily express their ideas on social media, there have been increasing connections as well between popular movements, or it's given rise to a language of human rights that's shared across very diverse contexts. So people will take their local situation and realize, hey, the marginalization that I'm facing is related to this countrywide structure and this global structure of marginalization, and it helps people more easily connect their own struggles to the struggles of others. And I wonder to what extent that has contributed to greater sympathy for Palestinians, and as you mentioned, maybe it could fuel this push toward anti-apartheid activism and creating more equality on the ground, because now it's easier to see the situation in Israel and Palestine as connected to and similar to apartheid type situations or discrimination in other places.
I suspect that is going to be the part of Beinert's argument and his article that's going to be the most prescient, because I suspect that in the U.S., for instance, the younger generation of American Jews, I suspect, was very present at the recent Black Lives Matter protests, for instance, and I think that the logic of one leads directly into the logic of the other, and will drive more activism among the younger generation of American Jews, for sure, to this kind of cause. That the idea that Beinart, the way in which he represents it as a moral cause that is compelling, I do think that is going to speak to people. And then in the same way, Freddy, that you mentioned, the way in which would the Black Lives Matter movements adopt Hong Kongers' pro-democracy movement, that could be the case. I think that a one-state equal solution for Israel-Palestine is a much easier translation, if you like, of the language of of the Black Lives Matter global protest movement to adopt. So I think that probably, I suspect that when we look back on it, if anything comes of it, that will be the most prescient part of his argument. Freddy, any last thoughts before we move on to the WPR articles we want to flag for everyone?
No, I think it's a good point to end on there. And that's sort of what is hopeful in these protest stories and just developments that we're seeing, that it isn't, of course it is about arguing political details and understanding, how complicated and how challenging change is, but there also is a sort of simple force in a social movement that has a very direct message, that is, equality or justice, and whether that's what we've seen in the U.S. or now if that's being extended to other long-standing problems, that it's a different way of imagining a solution to a problem that everyone has sort of been resigned to for decades, basically has no solution.
It's a very unpredictable alchemy whereby an idea or a cause that is unreasonable and impossible suddenly becomes inevitable. And I'm repeating myself, but I think that if there's any way that this idea could become inevitable, it's through that moral language that he's identified. All right, time to get to the WPR articles we want to flag for everyone this week. Freddy, which one did you have in mind?
Candace Rondeau's latest column on what a U.S. response to the Russian bounties in Afghanistan might actually look like. And as Candace points out, the reality is the U.S. actually has a very limited range of options, not least because an election is looming, and between Donald Trump and also what Congress has on its radar, basically she doesn't have any hope that there'll be substantive policy action anytime soon.
And Prachi?
This week's feature by Kentaro Toyama on the sharing economy. When countries began going into lockdown, some speculated that this could spell the end of the sharing economy business model. Airbnb and Uber, for example, were laying off thousands of employees and losing a ton of money. So Kentaro writes that these fears were overblown, and in fact, many sharing economy companies are thriving as they adapt their businesses to the new climate. And the pandemic's effects seem to differ by industry, not by business model. But at the same time, he writes, the pandemic has also shed new light on the way many of these companies neglect the gig workers that their businesses rely on. Ultimately, policymakers working on economic rescue packages will need to decide if the sharing economy is worth saving, he writes. Quote, if policymakers see the sharing economy as a symptom of capitalist malaise, as many of its critics contend, then little needs to be done to support it.
All right. And I'll mention a briefing by Deborah Martinez and Juan Pablo Delgado on Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador's disastrous management of the country's economy, which predates the coronavirus pandemic but has been exacerbated by the economic fallout from Mexico's response to the pandemic. AMLO, as he's known, campaigned on a promise of bringing about a so-called fourth transformation of Mexico's political and social landscape, but many of his policies have had unintended consequences that had already tipped Mexico into a recession before the pandemic hit. Since then, things have only got worse. As Deborah and Juan Pablo write, quote, "In the end, 19 months is all it took to cripple the world's 15th largest economy. AMLO's fourth transformation may have started with a bang. It appears it will end with a dry cough," unquote. All right, two things I want to mention before we get to the Who Said That segment. First, if you'd like to stay up to date on everything we cover at WPR, go ahead and sign up for our free daily newsletter at wpr.pub/trendlines. And second, if you'd like to drop us a line with questions or comments, you can email us at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. All right, time for Who Said That? Freddy, why don't you kick things off?
We don't mind staying home for another 3 days. That wasn't the problem. However, they're playing with our minds and with the truth. When it suits them to do elections, there is no corona. They organize football matches and tennis matches, and because of that, we have a situation where the hospitals are full.
I know what this is referring to, Prachi.
I feel like I should know this, but I'm not sure. You go ahead.
It's the protests in Serbia against an extension or a reimposition of the lockdown there.
Exactly. Yeah, this is the first major backlash and unrest over the virus in Europe so far.
And Prachi, what do you got?
Okay, here it is. I think he has this idea he can bend the narrative around Donald Trump, that he has figured Trump out and he is going to come up here to prove it. And I don't think that's going to be borne out.
I think I know what this is about, Freddy. I bet you do too.
Yeah, this is about AMLO's visit to Washington this week.
Yep, exactly.
Which Frida Giddis covered in her column this week as well. So we had a both domestic and international lens on AMLO. All right, here's mine. There are worrying allegations that disturb everyone, myself included. There are media that won't look the other way, a judiciary that is taking action, and the palace is distancing itself.
I don't know. Go ahead, Freddy.
I guess I want to say it's the UK because of the palace, but I can't think of what latest scandal might have engulfed Boris Johnson, so I'm not sure.
It's actually Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez commenting on an investigation opened by Spain's Supreme Court into a $100 million kickback that former King Juan Carlos allegedly received from the late Saudi King Abdullah for his role in brokering a high-speed rail contract in Saudi Arabia. It follows Juan Carlos having his palace allowance cut off by the current King Felipe after the Swiss press revealed that Juan Carlos had used secret offshore accounts to stash money starting in 2008, including the so-called donation from the then Saudi king. All sorts of going on in Spain.
Kings paying other kings kickbacks.
Indeed. It's good to be the king until you get caught. All right. Great stuff. Thanks, Freddy.
Thanks, Judah.
Thanks, Judah.
If you'd like to stay up to date on everything we cover at WPR, go ahead and sign up for our daily newsletter at wpr.pub/trendlines. In addition to free access to selected WPR articles all week long, you'll also get a promotional code for a 25% discount on a WPR subscription. And if you'd like to send comments or questions, email us at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. Trendlines is produced and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow him and World Politics Review on Twitter, and you can find links to pieces covering the issues we talked about in the show notes on worldpoliticsreview.com. Have a great weekend, and see you next week for 2 new episodes of Trendlines.